Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Frieden, and I worked with Dr. Patrick Nani this summer on in-season forecasting of grain yield and soil moisture in winter wheat. So the winter wheat growing season in the Southern Great Plains region has several stages, and understanding and being able to predict these stages and how these stages affect final winter wheat grain yield allows farmers to make decisions that affect and increase their final grain yield at the end of the season. And one of these critical periods is the transition between winter dormancy and rapid growth stages, which occurs between mid-February and mid-March. And this period is a key time for the application of nitrogen fertilizer. And that's affected by expected grain yields. So being able to predict this final winter wheat grain yields based on what we know about the crop in mid-February could allow the farmers to change the amount of fertilizer that they use to maximize wheat yield and ultimately maximize profit. So the project that I worked on this summer focused on using a variety of parameters throughout the growing season to help predict the end of season winter wheat yields. And it's based on a currently existing crop forecasting model called the Forecast Dual KC model, which I can show after the poster. And the goal of my project was to quantify the error of the model at different points in the growing season, especially during this decision window. And a small amount of error during the decision window meant that producers could make decisions based on nitrogen fertilizer application more confidently. So we were more interested in the shape of the error curves, which we could then use to calibrate the model more effectively. So the model that we used takes as inputs root zone soil moisture, surface soil moisture, and green canopy cover observations that are taken in the field over the course of the growing season and predicts a variety of outputs, including wheat yield and final root zone soil moisture. And all of these parameters have to be calibrated for the specific fields and crops that are grown. And then the data for this project came from 8 plots in the Ashland Bottoms and 2 replications. 4 of them had an October 15th, 2020 planting date, and 4 of them had a November 7th, 2020 planting date. And all of these 8 plots were growing winter wheat. So over the course of the season, we collected root zone soil moisture, surface soil moisture, and stage of the crop and the green canopy cover. And at the beginning of the season, we also collected residue cover for the plots using the SRP deep learning model. And at the end of the season, we collected wheat yield harvest data. So the first priority for the project was to determine the correct calibration of model parameters for the crop forecasting model. And I'm going to point out just a few of these key calibration factors. The first parameter, like the basal crop coefficients, including which was the crop evapotranspiration over the reference evapotranspiration at different points in the growing season. And then the next parameters we have like this base temperature and upper temperature. And then so we also have this parameter for yields potential, which is the yields potential in the region instead of in these specific plots. So we have 6.5 metric tons per hectare overall based on Dr. Lovato's work. And then we also have these permanent wilting point and fields capacity, which were taken from field tests.
She froze.
Oh, there she's back.
Oh, sorry.
For a minute, Liz.
Okay. What is the last thing you heard?
How much yield potential?
Okay. So then we also have the permanent wilting point and field capacity from the field tests, and the crop forecasting model relies very heavily on the difference between these 2 points. So a small change in one of these points has large effects on the error of the model. So future work definitely has to look into the accuracy of these points, particularly because they're so dependent on location and vital to the model. So this first figure here shows the percent canopy cover over the region, which is again measured from these downward facing images that were analyzed using the foliage app. So this gray window here is the decision window from mid-February to mid-March. And these lines mark the end of the model crop stages. So for example, this is the initial stage, this is the development stage, et cetera. So you can really see the timing of the decision window in this graph. So as a reminder, it's just after the dormancy stage and just before the rapid growth stage. And then this next graph shows the root zone soil moisture over the course of the season in each planting date. So these purple points here are our precipitation. And again, we have our decision window. So one of the first thing that you can see from this graph is that the root zone soil moisture roughly tracks precipitation, which is expected. And we also see a little more variability in the end of the season root zone soil moisture than the beginning of the season root zone soil moisture, which would be something that would be especially interesting to see in other years. And as a reminder, what we're trying to do is predict like these points from here. So then when we start looking at the air calculations, this figure 3 shows the air and the root zone soil moisture predictions. So we have the October 15th planting date here on the left and the November 7th planting date here on the right as a function of the days to harvest. So for both planting dates, the mean absolute air decreases most significantly right after harvest. So, and then the change in air slows down around 200 days, which is around December for the October 15th planting date and near February for the November 7th planting date. And both of these are before the required decision window of mid-February to mid-March. So that indicates that based on soil root zone soil moisture alone, producers could change their inputs with some accuracy in this decision window. But then producers are more interested in the final harvest wheat yields. So ideally, we'd like to predict the final wheat yield accurately before the decision window as well, in order to determine whether the application of the increased nitrogen fertilizer is worth its cost. So figure 4 shows this error in the harvest wheat yield over time. And you'll see that the error in the wheat yield is pretty steady over the course of the season for both planting dates until about 50 days before harvest, which isn't until April or early May. So this is after the decision window. So we would want to do some further calibration to see if we can lessen the mean absolute error for the wheat yield earlier in the season, which might involve relooking at some of the parameters above, like this field capacity. And then this last figure is just meant to check whether the replications of the experiment can be accurately compared based on their characteristics. So you see the root zone soil moisture differences compared to the mean over the course of the season. And as you can see, there's a fair amount of spread in each of the two graphs with a wider spread in the November 7th planting date. And you can also see in the November 7th planting date, the root zone soil moisture for the plots is fairly stratified. For example, plot 307, which is this red one, is a little bit drier than the mean. And you can see here, it's a little higher than average in air. So what would be an interesting question would be, can these averages be used effectively? And are these characteristics of are there characteristics of the plots that change the error of the forecasting model? But we can see that overall, the root zone soil moisture is very similar, and the shape of both graphs are fairly similar. So probably these replications can be compared, but we do have to keep this discrepancy in mind. So overall, the model predicts root zone soil moisture in time to make decisions in the decision window in mid-February to mid-March, but doesn't accurately predict wheat yield in time for this decision. And because producers are most likely to prefer to use wheat yield as a marker of whether to increase the use of nitrogen fertilizer, future work should look at the calibration of this part of the model specifically, and also examine other fields and plots in different locations to see whether air timing is consistent. And then I guess just here's the model. So as an example of plot, so if this is for plot 303. So for example, you can change the forecasting date and you can see the root zone soil moisture, and these green dots are the observed values. So as you change the forecasting date, it changes the prediction for root zone soil water. And down here, the same for the wheat yields. So I'd like to thank Dr. Patrignani and all of the graduate students in this lab. And does anybody have any questions?
I have a question, Liz. I know